The Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce runs a public lecture programme exploring contemporary issues. Teachers TV has unique access to these lectures, and today we bring you the full lecture of Baroness Mary Warnock on the theme The Foundations of Global Morality. She'll explore ideas of both private and public morality and develop an argument for a public ethic that extends beyond the nation-state. She will cite the example of the ethics of medical research trials as an example of a moral issue that is also global. We've sent a group of teachers to listen to her talk, and we'll hear their responses after the lecture.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight we're delighted to welcome Baroness Warnock to open this series with a lecture on the foundations of global morality. Never has there been a more timely or perhaps critical moment in our history to ignite this debate. A few words about our speaker, though she needs little introduction. Baroness Warnock, whose contribution to ethical deliberation in this country has been a sustained and outstanding one. During all my sentient years, Baroness Warnock has stood on the stage of ethical debate and has been a great influence in many people's lives. She's a crossbench life peer, moral philosopher, and author of a number of books on ethics, education, and the philosophy of mind, including, and I can recommend it, The Intelligent Person's Guide to Ethics. From 1979 to 1984, she was a member of the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution. She chaired the Committee of Inquiry on Human Fertilization and Embryology. From 1984 to 1989, she sat on the Home Office Committee on Animal Experimentation, and for 6 years was Mistress of Girton College, Cambridge, and that's just a few of her. I couldn't read them all. Ladies and gentlemen, Mary Warnock.
Well, I am enormously honoured to have been asked to take part in this series of lectures, and rather happy that I'm going to start it off, because I needn't then anxiously wonder whether I'm going to repeat what's going to come in the other lectures. And I am also going to talk about the foundations of global ethics. So I'm not going to address some of the huge problems, or not directly, that we're faced with. Now, the foundations or the origins of any ethics, however wide or narrow their scope, lies in the moral sense of the individual. And without this, there could be no morality at all, either in the private or the public sphere, either in personal decision-making or in public policy. No set of laws or principles can cause people to want to be good. And it's from this preference for good rather than evil that stems all morality, both theoretical and practical. It's a preference that must, if possible, be learned in the playground and the classrooms of nursery school and primary school, and again, of course, if possible, in the family. Wanting to be good, wanting to do good rather than harm to other people, is a personal want, a private wish or ideal, which we hope becomes part of the individuality of each one of us. Now, it may be inspired originally by a desire to please, or a desire not to offend a parent or a teacher, or by the reflection that things are nicer all round, for oneself included, if one tries to be good rather than bad. But however it begins, if it's instilled at an early age, it takes off on its own. It becomes part of a person's character. Now, in aiming for this ideal of good rather than harm, each one of us alone is responsible for our actions, our projects, and our words. As we all know very well, there are those who have never acquired this preference for good rather than harm. And there may be others who once had it but have lost it, allowing it to be smothered by greed, by the pleasures of power, or by sheer despair. But society depends on our holding on to it, whether we think of society as small or large. Now, some people believe that the concept of morality must derive from religion. Others, and I think I share this view, that the great monotheistic religions themselves seek to encapsulate and enshrine, even codify, a pre-existing concept of the right way for human beings to live. But whichever of these opinions is nearer to the historical truth, and however deeply influenced any morality has been by the prevailing religious culture, in our case mostly the Judeo-Christian culture, it is, in my view, of the very greatest importance, if we seek to conceive of global ethics, that we separate the idea of morality from that of religion. Now, this does not mean abandoning religion. It means only that when we argue about right and wrong, we should keep separate arguments based on human morality, the desire of human beings in society to do good rather than harm, from those based on divine law. And this is not simply because of the, I'm afraid, never more obvious fact that different religions preach different moral standards. It's rather that there are increasing numbers of people who, because they can't reconcile a literal understanding of religious texts with the other things that they know, have given up religion altogether. They can't envisage any kind of truth but literal truth. And they don't recognize that the great religions may contain truths that are other than literal, as great myths always have. If they can't believe that the world was created literally in 7 days, then they can't tolerate religion at all. For these people, however much they may respect and admire the wisdom of religious leaders, or those members of church or synagogue who speak with the voice of theology, any moral argument that's to be persuasive must start and end with humanity. In their moral philosophy, people have only one life, that which they are living now. And there are lives that are good and flourishing, and lives that are not. Not because of accident or chance, but because of the behavior of human beings themselves in their relations with one another. It's to the ameliorating of those lives that their morality is directed. In my opinion, the danger, and I think it is a danger, the danger of theological arguments for such amelioration is that they may suggest that if you abandon theology, you must also abandon morality. No criminal law, whether the law of a particular country or a fledgling international law, can be founded upon anything else except a humanist morality. Its authority must be based on a shared understanding, both of the moral justification of the law, that is, its intention to do good rather than harm to people as a whole, and the proper processes through which it has become law. To attempt to justify a law prohibiting euthanasia on the basis of a religious prohibition, no longer part of a shared understanding, is to undermine that law, even if it were enacted by proper process. Because there are shared understandings of what is tolerable and what is intolerable for human beings to put up with, difficult though it may be to formulate these shared understandings. Such understandings are, I suppose, what form the concept of human rights. But whether we use the language of rights or not, it is upon a shared view of what is wrong, or what is a wrong that cannot be condoned by any human being, that law must be founded. Religion, on the other hand, is in danger of propounding doctrines that of their very nature exclude some people from consideration, namely those who disobey or disregard divine law. Nothing could be a sharper reminder of this than the recently translated statements of Osama bin Laden, called Messages to the World. One of his statements in Messages to the World is this: every Muslim, from the moment they realize the distinction in their heart, hates Americans, hates Jews, hates Christians. This is part of our belief and our religion. Equally inimical, I think, to a shared understanding is the belief of some American fundamentalist Christians that murder is justified if the victim has ever carried out an abortion. These are the reasons why I believe that the distinction between morality and religion, complicated though the connections between the two are, the distinction between the two is something that we must observe. But besides the crucial distinction between morality and religion, there's another distinction that needs to be made. Like the former, it involves two concepts that, though distinct from one another, nevertheless overlap. And this is the distinction between private and public morality. I've already stated my conviction that morality or ethics of whatever kind depends fundamentally on the possession by individuals of a moral sense, a sensitivity to the existence of what is right, a wish to do what is right rather than what is wrong, and, I would add, a willingness to accept responsibility for a wrong that has been perpetrated by him, the person, as an individual. Against this background, in the sphere of private morality, the individual possessed of such a moral sense will find occasion, even while still a child, when he may prefer the interests of others to his own interests, when gradually he will acquire the crucial concept of altruism or unselfishness. And along with this, he will acquire a sense of shame when he has acted selfishly, greedily, or treacherously. These ideas of unselfishness, even occasionally self-sacrifice, and of shame if one has failed to do what is known and felt to be right, are both of them central to the concept of being good, which is what the morally civilized person wants for himself. And without such individual conscience, as we may reasonably call it, there can, as I've said, be no morality at all. However, in contrast with this, when someone is acting in a public capacity, when, that is, as a politician or a headmaster, he is trying to make a decision about public policy, or as a civil servant, perhaps advising a minister on what would be good legislation in a particular field, then, though he may still hope to do good rather than harm, he must of necessity be looking at the long-term and general consequences of what he is proposing. He must ask himself what will be the effect on society as a whole, or the institution for which he is responsible, if this measure is carried through. The good and the harm that enter into his deliberations must take a universal colour, and he must become, to some extent, a utilitarian, that is, judging policies by their probable general consequences, their likely outcome. In the eyes of the legislator, good laws that promote the well-being of society as a whole or protect it from harm are the only laws that are morally good. Now, of course, the individual who exercises a public role, if he's not corrupted by his power, retains his own conscience and will have to try to test what he's proposing against the dictates of that conscience. If, for example, he finds that he's being asked to carry out a judicial murder or a war of unjust aggression, and his conscience tells him so, then he must resign his office. As Stuart Hampshire once put it in his book, Public and Private Morality, published in 1978, said, someone who has committed public wrongs in the exercise of his office can be just as guilty as a private criminal. Nevertheless, the differences are quite sharp. Let us imagine a committee of inquiry set up to advise ministers in carrying out their function. On such a committee, there'll be no call for personal altruism or self-sacrifice. These concepts are alien to the public ethics that will issue in policy statements or finally in legislation. The committee will be asked instead to take account of all the facts and assess the probable consequences of the policies that they're considering, and whether, if legislation is to result from their advice, the law will be enforceable. Consider, for example, a committee set up to advise on legislation concerned with abortion, such as the Peel Committee once was. Should abortion be prohibited by law, or permitted subject to regulation, or permitted without any restriction? This is the question before the committee. And it's a moral question, there's no doubt. Now, one can imagine a member of such a committee who was personally completely hostile to abortion on religious or conscientious grounds, or both, who nevertheless went along with the corporate view that regulation was the best way forward. Because to permit abortion without restriction, quite apart from his own detestation of such an idea, to permit abortion without restriction would show a contempt for human life that would be damaging to society in the long term, while to prohibit it altogether would be damaging to society in another way. Abortion can't be altogether stamped out by law, and if it continued illegally, both it would cause many deaths, as indeed happened before the law was changed in the 1960s, but also, and more important, the law would be brought into contempt. Because, as I've said, the question whether a law is or is not enforceable is a crucial question for such committees, as well as for the ministers that they're advising. Because if laws may be disregarded with impunity, then the rule of law itself, by which we as a society must live, the rule of law itself will be undermined. It is the rule of law that's the infrastructure of public morality. Public morality, or the public ethics as I've so far described it, is the morality that governs the citizens of a state. And the laws that are to be obeyed are the laws of that state. We must obey the laws, though we may declare them to be wrong, and though we may campaign against them. In Jeremy Benson's words, it's our duty to obey immediately, criticise ceaselessly. Until we can persuade Parliament to amend or revoke a law, it's our law, and we depend upon it. Because we, as members of a state, we are a commonwealth. And in Locke's words, in the second treatise on civil government, whoever has the legislative or supreme power in any commonwealth is bound to govern by established and standing laws, promulgated and known to the people, and not by extemporary decree, and bound to govern by indifferent and upright judges who are to decide controversies by those laws. And those are very important words. But as far as those outside the Commonwealth, outside the state, are concerned, in Locke's day, in the 17th century, it seemed that there was no rule of law outside the state. Princes, to quote Locke again, are in a state of nature. The only law they have to obey in relation one to another is the law of nature. And the law of nature entitles each one to be a law to himself and to act always in his own interest or that of the country he governs. And so, at last, we are in a position to ask the question whether there can be a kind of public morality or ethics that extends beyond the state. Have we really moved on from the 17th century? What would constitute a global ethic? Can we envisage a kind of public morality that, like the public morality of a state, can rely on the rule of law, but on a global scale? Now, some of you may have read an intensely gloomy book by Roger Scruton that was published in 2002 called The West and the Rest, in which he argued that it is impossible realistically to envisage any such thing, and that the reason lies in the very concept of citizenship and the commonwealth or state, a concept that the West inherited from the Greeks and enshrined in constitutional law. And there is, I think, a terrible plausibility in such a doom-laden theory. In his RSA lecture in Edinburgh last August, Mark Leonard put it thus, and I quote, "500 years ago, Europeans invented the most effective form of political organization in history, the nation-state. Countries were faced with a stark choice: become a nation-state or be taken over by one. Nationalism was born, not in the sense of one nation planning to take over other nations and impose on them their own laws, not imperialism, but in the sense of one nation, each nation, adopting as the focus of its political and its cultural life its own separate laws, separate from those of other nations and without any imperialistic designs upon other nations. Europe has exemplified this kind of nationalism since the end of the Second World War. What I have called public morality must consist in the attempt to act with a view to consequences that will be for the common good. But the common good will be conceived first and foremost as the good of the nation-state to which loyalty is embedded in government. In contrast, according to Roger Scruton's argument, the adherents of Islam are torn, and I insist that they are torn, between the desire, which among many of them is very strong, to live by the rule of law, the law that governs the country of which they are citizens, and an intrinsically supranational ideal, that of a world envisaged in the original vision of Islam and subject to God's law, interpreted by essentially theocratic institutions, which are indifferent to the particular citizenship of those who are subject to them. There is no separation here between religion and politics, or religion and morality, or the church and the state. The ideal of Islam is that of a global ethic, but one founded on obedience and ritual, rather than on institutions whose authority is accepted by consent. The ideals, according to Scruton, are irreconcilable, and the consequences of this are apparent. That was the message of his book in 2002. But even if we are persuaded by such arguments as these, and reluctantly obliged to conclude that the ideals of the West and of Islam are genuinely incompatible, still we have to remember that fundamentalist Islamic ideology does not cover the whole of the one non-Western globe. More practically, we must recognize that globalization is a reality for us, within which we have to live and to which we have to accommodate ourselves as moral creatures. We have to accommodate ourselves as well as we can. It's futile simply to throw up our hands in horror and say that to behave well on a global scale is impossible. We are aware as never before of problems that can't be thought of as national problems, such as, for example, the urgent problem of climate change, the spread of disease and infection, or of the traffic in drugs, and the consequent organized crime, which is indifferent to national frontiers. We are in constant and instant communication with far-flung parts of the world, to the extent that if you ring up your bank, you're as like as not to be answered by somebody in India. And increasingly, we're beginning to feel a responsibility for poverty worldwide. Partly, it has to be said, in our own interests. All this has transformed the world since Locke's day, since the 17th century. And if we have a moral sense, a conscience, as I described it at the beginning, wanting on the whole to make things better, not worse, to do good, not harm, then we must want to act well rather than badly as citizens of the world, not merely of our own territory. So the question is, how can this global ethic be developed? Is it a contradiction in terms, as Roger Scruton's argument might suggest? Well, the first thing to be said, I suppose, is that just as within one country we are dependent upon the rule of law, so in the world as a whole, we must struggle, I believe, to be loyal to what feeble and imperfect approximations we have to an international law. We must try hard to be loyal to the United Nations and never disregard it, because it's the only thing we have, the only thing we've got that might conceivably come to be trusted as the source and the buttress of global ethics. We must try not to despair of it, but to seek ways to strengthen and improve it. But as important as that is, it's not enough. More immediate and more practical must be a determination that, in a global context, we act according to what, in a national context, we would think right. Just as a public morality can't exist without a foundation in private moral sense, so global morality must depend, for its existence, on the morality of the nation-state. And I want to give just one example to show what I mean. The existence of multinational companies is one of the most obvious examples of globalization, and one which is an existing reality, not a conflict-ridden set of aspirations, like the United Nations. In thinking about a possible global ethics, we would do better, I think, to look at the World Trade Organization than anything that is more overtly political. Now, among multinational companies, those of the pharmaceutical industry are some of the most conspicuous. It's impossible that new drugs could be developed for the alleviation of human suffering without commercial companies, as well as governments and charities, putting money into the enterprise, developing their own programs, and applying for patents in their innovations to protect their commercial viability. But such companies must have twin goals: profitability and the good of mankind. And these aims may sometimes, of course, conflict. It's easy for greed to drive out humanitarianism. But humanitarian motives must be part of the driving force of the pharmaceutical companies and will dictate their corporate ethic. Now, my example is the fairly narrow issue of the development of drugs to tackle disease in poorer countries and the consequential use of people of those countries in clinical trials. This was an issue examined in depth by the Nuffield Council on Bioethics in the year 2002 in their publication, The Ethics of Research Related to Healthcare in Developing Countries. The ethics of clinical trials is quite complex, even in countries such as our own, where it is generally agreed that no one can be part of a trial without informed consent. And it's fairly widely understood that a proper trial requires that there must be a group of controls, so that some people, unknown to themselves or to their doctors, will not be given the new drug, but either the best of the established drugs or a placebo. It's an ethical imperative that testing should be carried out meticulously and according to these rules before a drug is released onto the market. But in the poorer countries, there are great difficulties in obeying the imperative. And in particular, there is the danger that those taking part in the trial will be exploited in the pejorative sense of that word. For most of those taking part in the trial will have a very limited access to health care and to drugs. And the trial will be seen by them to bring with it an improvement in their lot, the trial itself, whatever its outcome may be. Here at last they may think will be a chance of treatment. And since poverty and ignorance often go together, there will be many of them whose consent is not truly informed because of the complexity of the idea of a clinical trial. In particular, it may be hard to explain that some of those treated will not be given the new drug, nor even whatever drug they may have been taking till now, but will be given a placebo. The idea of a control is a relatively sophisticated concept. And another factor here is that in some countries, decision to take part may be a community rather than an individual decision, women especially being unaccustomed to make decisions without guidance. In any case, it may be difficult for those taking part to realize that the drug in question may never be developed, but may go no further than the trial because it's shown to be ineffective or to have harmful side effects. And yet, everyone who sets up a trial of a new drug urgently needs volunteers for this last stage. So it's very easy for companies desperate to be first in the market with the new and proved and potentially lucrative product to exert undue pressure on people to take part, feeding them with false hopes or with promises of free continuing treatment. And these promises of free continuing treatment are particularly contentious. Some companies make extravagant undertakings to provide free or affordable drugs of the highest standard of effectiveness after the trial is over, without specifying what the drugs will be or for how long they will be supplied. Such open-ended promises are highly unlikely to be honoured and are extremely likely to give rise not merely to disappointment, but to resentment and cynicism. The whole community within which the trials are carried out will very reasonably feel that they have been exploited, their poverty taken advantage of by the rich. Now, the Nuffield Council made a number of recommendations to those sponsoring such research, at the heart of which lay the demand that the people concerned should not have trials imposed on them by the sponsors, but should produce their own list of priorities and should then, as far as possible, be educated in and take a full part in the research and the trials, so that after they're over, they will be better able themselves to provide ongoing health care. Above all, they should, with the sponsors, take part in ethical scrutiny of the project as it goes on, weighing up the harms and the benefits both in the short and the long term. The authors of the report, the Nuffield report, are well aware of the sensitivity to local conditions and local assumptions and local understandings that such an educative programme would involve. But they conclude that nothing else will prevent exploitation, to avoid which is the overriding moral imperative. Now, I've treated this case at some length because, although it is only an example, it indisputably raises a moral issue that is also global. I've just quoted the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, and I entirely agree with their conclusion that the ethical imperative in the case is to avoid the exploitation of the vulnerable, whether their vulnerability arises from ignorance, from sickness, or from poverty, or indeed from all of these. Now, of course, the equalization of wealth worldwide would, I suppose, eventually overcome the most serious dangers of exploitation. But this is so abstract an ideal, so infinitely distant a goal, that it can't provide answers to the practical question of how we should behave towards the poor worldwide. As things are, there seems to be no room for doubt that it is in the public interest, in the widest possible sense, that research into the diseases of the poorer countries should be sponsored and financed by the richer countries. What is needed is a commitment on the part of all sponsors, and most especially commercial sponsors, to proper and impartial ethical scrutiny, both of their proposals and of their implementation. The guidelines for such scrutiny to be in the public domain, and the impartiality of the watchdogs to be beyond question. And here I think there is an area, you may say a small area, where the concept of global ethics is not a fantasy. I believe that the strengthening of ethics committees advising international commercial companies is of the very greatest importance. But it is a very difficult demand to satisfy. It's very hard to find people who are willing to give the time and effort needed to make up such advisory committees and who are in no way to profit from their work. Too often now, such ethical advisors, though they may be lay advisors in that they're not scientists involved in the research, are nevertheless, in other ways, employees of the company and cannot be regarded as totally disinterested. Because it would be difficult, if not impossible, for them to accuse their employers of corporate inhumanity. But let us suppose for a moment that such difficulties of forming ethics committees for international companies, that these difficulties could be overcome. And supposing that it became generally agreed that companies were expected to take into account the avoidance of exploitation, as well as of profits, then I think we might, as I've said, have here an intelligible approach to global ethics. It would not constitute a system of law, but rather of self-regulation on the part of the corporations. And the motive for such self-regulation would be a conviction that to exploit the weak does not become the strong. I have no time and no ability to explore the questions of how far my commercial example can be generalized and followed into more overtly political territories, but I believe that it probably could. But at least from my one example, we may come back to the beginning. To be ashamed of taking advantage of the weak or profiting from exploitation of the poor is a moral sentiment that must first be learned by the individual in childhood. And it is a sentiment that must be carefully nurtured against the temptation of greed, whether greed for power or greed for money. Ultimately, a global morality, like the morality of an individual, must rest on the recognition that we are all, individually and corporately, going to be tempted to do things of which we would be ashamed if we are to be moral beings at all. The hope is that, unlike other animals, human beings are able, if they wish, to overcome temptation. And this must be the hope, whether these human beings are acting as individuals or as elements in a corporate morality.
So we're going to open for questions now. Let's start off, if we can, thank you, with the first question. I think you had your hand up first there.
Thank you. Ramnik Shah, I'm a fellow of the Society as well. There is now, in the postmodernist, post-colonial world, we have a cultural hegemony which is propelling international relations, cultural and political hegemony of a superpower, and the rest have to either conform or be subsumed or be subjugated. So what I'm saying is that surely there are all kinds of other countervailing forces, and where is the consensus there?
I think I know that I was extremely oversimplifying, and I entirely agree with you that there is a whole range of different questions, all of which may be very difficult to solve if one's thinking of global ethics. But I think my very simple point was that if you have somebody who, as a child or who later loses, who has no sense of what is an intolerable thing for other people to suffer, if there's a child who's brought up with no such sense, who doesn't give a damn for other people, whether they suffer or not, then there is no foundation whatever for global ethics.
Was your point, Mr. Shah, also, did I hear you mention the word superpower?
Yes, I did.
Were you really referring to America, perhaps?
Yes, I was.
I wonder if we might just take that head on, because it is a word that is now bandied about, and books are written, and there's quite a considerable feeling, Mary, I think, in the population as a whole, that America almost has set itself up as the world government, as the dictator of what is a just war or a moral position. And as Mr. Shah points out, that's considerably at variance with an enormous number of the world's population.
So where are the foundations?
I know that this is the view, and I knew we were talking about America.
Sorry.
And the difficulty here is, I think, that we, many of us, including me, feel so passionately about the position that we're now in with regard to Iraq and Afghanistan, and try to rescue the concept of a just war, that it is really, I think, an issue on which I at least find it very difficult to talk either coherently or rationally.
Right.
But I don't mind trying. But I do think, I think that if you're talking about morality, morals or ethics, and I don't make any difference between these two, if you're talking about that, then you must hope that example has some part to play. And here again, I go back to my very simplistic repetition of the concept of teaching morality to children. The only way that morality can be taught to children is through example, by saying that something is intolerable and it won't be put up with, but by always behaving according to that rule yourself. And I think this puts a huge responsibility on teachers. But they have to teach morality by example.
Talking about teachers, it does lead me to notice that we have a couple of teachers in the audience tonight. Can I have the first question from one of them, please?
Yeah, sorry, I'm a secondary school teacher, and you say that the only way to teach morality is through example. Is there a place for explicit moral instruction in schools at all? Is there a place for words like "you should do this," "you mustn't do that," and such prescriptive language, or should it only be implicit?
In the 1960s, I know I'm going to sound like Margaret Thatcher, but never mind. I think that there was an ethos in the education of teachers that put a great deal of emphasis on impartiality, not explicitly taking sides on any issue. And this always seemed to me a bit dotty, I have to say. But I'm not talking about teaching children what on a global scale is right or wrong. I'm not talking about teaching them the evils of cutting down the rainforests. I'm talking about very young children having it made clear to them that there is a difference between good behaviour and horrible behaviour. And using Kingsley Amos's words, nice things are nicer than nasty things. And we have a very, very clear, common notion of what is nasty when we're talking about children in the playground, children in the classroom. Nobody likes being bullied. Nobody likes being deceived. Nobody likes having their possessions stolen from them or ruined by other people. There is at that very, very, very low level a huge consensus of what counts as good behaviour and what counts as horrible behaviour. And it is the role of teachers, I think, to say to children, that's a horrible thing to do. Don't you ever let me see you do that again. And put terrific emphasis on the horribleness for other people of what that particular child has just done.
Right, now does any other teacher want to comment on that? Or do you want to have a completely different question?
What you've just said applies very much to primary schools. When we move into the secondary schools, how can the secondary school itself create opportunities for the people who have got that inner sense to demonstrate it to their peers? Because it's the influence of peer on peer that works against the well-intentioned teacher quite often.
Yes.
I think that is the most incredibly interesting thing, because there is obviously coming through into secondary school from primary school lots of children whose home life and whose teachers' lives have led them into having this kind of conscience, feeling ashamed when they do something they know is wrong, and all those things that I was talking about. But they're under great pressure from other people who haven't acquired this. And I think that it's really extraordinarily difficult. I wouldn't underestimate it a bit for secondary school teachers to, as you say, give the children who have got this moral sense a chance to exercise it without making fools of themselves. They're terrified of making fools of themselves. And if they stand out against something that they think is wrong, they wouldn't like to do, then they're going to be the object of ridicule or bullying or even physical violence. And I think that the only thing to say there is to go back actually several many years, to Michael Rutter's view that in good schools, actually the good ethos does prevail. And this is largely because the teachers themselves never do the things that they dislike other children doing.
I'd just like to kind of add a postscript here, because one of the programs that we run at the Institute for Global Ethics is a human rights award scheme, and it covers secondary schools and it covers the 5 nations. And what it does is it implicitly teaches children about human rights. And what we realized was that right across the nation, human rights had been really taken on board by these children in a most meaningful way. I mean, what do they know of Hobbes and Locke and the United Nations and the Declaration? But they had taken it to heart because they'd participated. And I just wanted to add that.
But I think it is very interesting that actually one of the first moral judgments that very small children make is to say it's jolly unfair.
Yes.
And jolly unfair involves the whole concept of human rights.
Yes, absolutely. It's based.
Let's hear how our teachers responded to the lecture.
I thought it was interesting because it was extremely wide-ranging, from the personal, from children in the playground, right up to the impact of multinationals and their ethics. And so I'm thinking about how that has an impact in terms of our classrooms and the children that we're working with.
It was sort of the school's responsibility to set the good in the child.
There seemed to be a massive, quite big assumption about what good was, and when she talked about the preference, the moral preference and wanting to be good and things like that, I don't know whether or not the knowledge of what is good comes before the wish to be good. It seemed to be, from what she was saying, it seemed that she was assuming that what is good comes before wanting that.
Did you feel that she was saying that we needed codes of goodness that were separate from faith-based?
She certainly was saying that.
Codes.
She certainly was saying that, but I think perhaps more importantly, she was talking about the ability to communicate across those sorts of divides.
Across faith divides.
Yeah, and across faith and secular divides.
I think that's interesting in terms of what our role is then, to help them think for themselves and come to their own decisions.
Providing the school gives them opportunities to do that.
Presumably that's what should be happening. And also, in relation to a global ethic, perhaps to come to some kind of consensus on some issues for themselves, especially with the kind of diversity that there is in the schools that I am working with. I was also thinking in relation to the talk about ethics in terms of the diversity that we have in our schools. For example, how a school can develop a sense of values which can be communal to everybody, that everybody can have that sense of shared ethics, and how we could possibly ever reach a point at which there would be no need for faith schools, because all schools could have a strong enough consensual global ethic, as it were.
That was the point she made about us needing almost a secular code distinct from the faith code,
therefore,
the divine
something
code.
needs to happen to strengthen whatever is going on in community secular schools that will be recognisable, that everybody would feel they can buy into, rather than feel they have to split off from, if it really is a global ethic which comes from a humanistic basis. But I was surprised by Mary Warnock's very Western perspective. So I think what I've come away with is how important it is for our children and young people to understand a range of ethical positions and to know about that, so that that will inform their own thinking about their own positions that they're going to take.
I'm not sure whether I've got the authority to say to a student or a child what they should do and what they should think is right and wrong. I certainly do it, and as Mary Warnock said, that there seems to be a certain amount of consensus on what's right and wrong. But I think I do it too much.
But when we asked her questions about education's role in this, the answer seemed to come to both our questions. It's good modelling by teachers in the school. It's the personal example.
I think I felt quite positive about that. I think there was my coming out of the lecture. up until the point where she said, basically, it's down to you to be a good example to people, I wasn't entirely sure what I was meant to do with everything that she'd said.
Yeah, for me that still leaves the issue, because of the diversity just amongst teachers, for us, of what model and what model for what. There's the kind of basic, the fundamental one, which I think that she kept coming back to, of basically of kind of being nice to each other, so therefore not bullying, etc.
But beyond, in my experience, teachers want to be good more than any other sector of the community.
But what about beyond?
It's back to this personal level that she kept saying was the key to the school's part in the development of a global.
When she kept coming back to that, kept coming back to the simple thing of being nice, and that everybody, I think, is very clear about not bullying, for example. And what I'm just wondering is, to what extent within all of this are all of us as teachers aware of the range of ethical positions of the children and young people that we're working with, and also of each other as different teachers. I think there is a lot of space in the curriculum that is given to citizenship issues, global citizenship issues, such as fair trade, etc., drop the debt, all these kind of things. But I wonder whether they, in part, feel that they're being given those as a kind of ethical stance. You should take this view.
It's almost as if the children themselves are becoming consumers of points of view, and we're just there to put forward a particular point of view which is attacked by people trying to sell things or something like that, and it's not giving the children the freedom to think, perhaps.
Yeah, see, I think we're in a danger of telling them, of giving them those ethics, of saying this is the good, rather than giving them that space to really be critical thinkers for themselves.
And that's what you said earlier, that it's easy for them to give us the right answer, but perhaps not so easy for them to do it in practice, in a real situation.
Yeah, it's like what George Eliot said about the greatest principle for human growth is in choice, isn't it, I suppose, rather than perhaps more than what they do, perhaps the way in which they arrive at the reason to do something. Perhaps.
Yeah, and I suppose that comes back to the thing of taking it for granted of what being good means, rather than giving a whole space for discussing and for coming to, and that's why when it comes back to the code of conduct, so there's ownership of that, of deciding, of thinking about what is being good, what is doing good, and what is making the world better, because she also referred to that as if that was a given, as if we had an agreed understanding about what making the world better is. Whereas for the children and young people that we work with, that in itself is is something which requires thinking about.
I think something I could take back to the RE classroom would be to talks like this show the children the reality and the importance of these sort of ethical discussions. I think often they seem to take place to the students in a sort of bubble, which they take place in the classroom and then don't leave the classroom. But here you can see the big impact, the real impact of discussions about ethics and what they can change in the world.
I think that's important, what they can change in the world, because it's going to be their world.
Yeah, and I think actually, from what you've both said, that also that for more teachers across subjects to see it as part of their domain, not citizenship education, not RE, but everything.